Welcome to Thought in Motion, a series dedicated to the seminars of psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. Today is on Lecture 7 in Seminar 2. In this video, I'll address the following questions. 1. What is the connection between Merleau-Ponty's thought and psychoanalysis? 2. How well do Lacan's critiques of Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology hold up when considering his later philosophy? And 3. What is the relationship between the death drive and the pleasure principle? If you learned something from this video and wish to support this work, please consider liking it, sharing it, and subscribing to my channel. Lecture 7 is very rich in ideas, so much so in fact that I'll be dedicating 2 videos to it. We begin this lecture, as we often have in this seminar, with Lacan mentioning another talk recently delivered, this time by the phenomenologist Maurice Merleau-Ponty. Lacan raises several concerns regarding Merleau-Ponty's position vis-a-vis psychoanalysis. Before discussing those concerns, it may be helpful to address our first question. 1. What is the connection between Merleau-Ponty's thought and psychoanalysis? In answering this question, it's perhaps best to separate out what is considered Merleau-Ponty's early thought from his later thought, since though there are notable continuities, his earlier work, such as the Phenomenology of Perception, published in 1945, places more emphasis on consciousness, lived experience, and Gestaltism. Lacan's critiques seem to be geared more toward this period of work. This is understandable since, at the time of Merleau-Ponty's lecture in 1955, he was perhaps just starting to develop what will come to consist of his later thought. In the Phenomenology of Perception, he argues that perception is the background and presupposition of all action. This connection between perception and action marks a break from at least 2 kinds of dualisms. One of those dualisms is between subject and object. The conception of knowledge as representation proposes that there is a correlation between the idea I have in my mind and the reality out there, which presupposes a divide between the subject and the object. The second dualism is between mind and body. Descartes established that we are made of 2 distinct substances, a non-physical substance, the mind, and a physical substance, the extended body. Like the subject-object dichotomy, a difficulty then needs to be resolved concerning how these 2 relate to one another. Though Descartes is perhaps the most prominent name associated with this view, it seems clear that Merleau-Ponty also has in mind another, more recent figure, Jean-Paul Sartre. Sartre also established 2 dimensions, our being in itself and our being for itself. We'll leave aside for now the 3rd dimension, which is being for the other. Being in itself is our facticity and immanence, those things that we have no control over. This includes the constitution of our bodies, its capacities, and genetic endowments. The other is our being for itself, which is our possibility and transcendence, that for which we have freedom to choose our possibilities. Sartre identifies this as consciousness and subjectivity. He places a great priority on our being for itself. I don't think it's as simple as this, but since this is not a lecture on Sartre, we'll leave it be for the moment. Merleau-Ponty, in contrast, sees our bodies as the site of our facticity and our freedom. So he argues against the kind of dualism he perceives in Sartre's thought in favor of a unified view of human subjectivity as a lived body, which is a unification of the being in itself and the being for itself. He writes that the body is the first locus of intentionality, as pure presence to the world and openness upon its possibilities. The word intentionality here refers to our ability to act in the world, to move, will, desire. In sum, to actualize possibilities. Motility, or movement, is the basic mode of intentionality which opens the world to us in its fundamental I can, rather than the I think. Movement entails moving in space, and Merleau-Ponty develops a notion of space that's not an objective measure of distances between objects. Rather, spatiality, as opposed to space, is a realm of possibility where I can move from here to there, from my present to my future, from actuality to possibility. How I move in my spatiality defines me. At the same time, I can become enclosed in a narrow spatiality, My possibilities can be limited by outside forces, prejudices, laws, etc., which restrict me. So we can see here how the relationship between the internal and external is also unified, moving us past the dichotomy of subject and object. Lacan, in Lecture 7, primarily focuses on the problematic notion of Gestaltism in Merleau-Ponty's thought. Gestalt theory considers the structures of perception in which the whole of experience exceeds what can be reduced to the elements or parts of that experience. For example, when I perceive a figure, I don't just perceive it in a void, but always with a background. In certain optical illusions, one can demonstrate how the figure and ground can at times be fluidly switched to create alternating gestalts. Merleau-Ponty found this position attractive for its philosophical implications. It showed how the experience of the world is always already imbued with interpretive meanings, to such a degree that one can't neatly separate the perceptual from the conceptual. In other words, our perceptual experience of the world is always already a unity of subject and object, rather than a correlation between my subjectivity here and the objective reality over there. This emphasis on the unity of experience, of mind and body, self and environment, for Lacan situates Merleau-Ponty's thought in the imaginary. So with that understanding now in place, where do Merleau-Ponty's views on psychoanalysis fit in here? Consistent with what I've already presented to you from the phenomenology of perception, he states that the significance of psychoanalysis is in discovering a dialectic that disrupts the binary between the bodily and the mental. He goes so far as to say that not only does psychoanalysis not oppose phenomenology, it helps develop it by showing how human action is always already meaningful. So let's move to question 2. How well do Lacan's critiques of Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology hold up when considering his later philosophy? The talk by Merleau-Ponty mentioned by Lacan in Lecture 7 was delivered on January 18, 1955, under the title Philosophy and Psychoanalysis. I've been unable to identify whether this talk was ever published. However, a short essay entitled Phenomenology and Psychoanalysis was published in 1960 and served as a preface for Esnar's The Work of Freud and Its Importance for the Modern World. It's uncertain how much of the 1955 talk remains in this 1960 essay. I suspect there were some major changes, as the 1960 essay clearly reflects some of Merleau-Ponty's later thought, which in fact Lacan speaks of much more approvingly in Seminar 11. This later thought shifts from his earlier emphasis on gestaltism and consciousness. In The Visible and the Invisible, he begins to develop a distinct ontology of the invisible, which he calls wild being, as well as the concept of the flesh. The flesh is something of an elemental principle and an anonymity of visibility. Most notably, he establishes the notion of a gap, a car, at the heart of every experience, which upsets the sort of integrated unity of experience that was evident in his earlier work. This implicit critique of his earlier thought becomes explicit in the working notes of this book, where he acknowledges the possibility that phenomenology of perception was hampered by a philosophy of consciousness. We don't know what would have come of this work had he finished it. Unfortunately, he died unexpectedly from a stroke while working on it. But I think we see some elements of it in the 1960 essay. In that essay, he indicates that phenomenology need not be a philosophy of consciousness. Rather, phenomenology descends into its own substratum in a manner that finds convergences with psychoanalysis. As such, he writes, they're both aiming toward the same latency, by which he means that concealed, unmanifested substratum of being that is outside of consciousness. Nonetheless, he does reinforce one of the criticisms Lacan levels against him in stating that both phenomenology and psychoanalysis can lead us toward a humanism of truth without metaphysics. Lacan has been very clear to indicate that psychoanalysis is not, nor can it be, a humanism, regardless of whether one understands that term as an affirmation of the goodness of humanity, the possibility of freedom and agency, or the inherent dignity of all human beings. Question 3. What is the relationship between the death drive and the pleasure principle? One of the reasons why psychoanalysis cannot be a humanism is because of the death drive. In this lecture, Lacan greatly furthers his development of this concept. He's particularly keen on showing its connection to the pleasure principle, which on the surface would seem to oppose it. So let's first take up how Lacan presents the pleasure principle in this lecture. He reiterates what he said in the previous lecture regarding its homeostatic function in reducing excitatory tensions to a minimum. There's a few difficulties that emerge here. First, the idea that the pleasure principle aims at the cessation of pleasure doesn't align with our intuitive understanding of pleasure. Yet, that's exactly what it aims at, the end of pleasure. And it's for this reason that it was originally called the unpleasure principle. A second difficulty Lacan notes is that this restorative function of the pleasure principle is not readily distinguished from the repetitive tendency of the death drive. And so, how do we understand this? Lacan deploys the concept of entropy to illustrate his point. The second law of thermodynamics states that an isolated system, left to its own devices, inevitably arrives at thermodynamic equilibrium, or what is the highest possible entropy. Entropy is a state of disorder or lack of organization. So, for example, heat that is concentrated in one part of the room will, without any intervention, eventually disperse equally within that given space. Entropy marks the arrow of time in the universe itself as it marches toward inevitable disorder, which is theorized to end up in the heat death of the universe. However, if this is the case, how is it that any complexity has emerged at all, especially in the form of life and human intelligence? First, we need to keep in mind that order and complexity are not the same in physics. To keep this simple, let's take the example of a cup of coffee with foamed milk on top. At first, the system contains very low entropy. It's highly ordered. Coffee and foamed milk are concentrated and clearly distinct from one another. There's no mixing whatsoever. But this system is not very complex because there hasn't been any mixing. Over time, the milk and coffee begin to mix, leading to the swapping of coffee and milk molecules. But through this mixing, complexity increases as there are varying regions of coffee and milk mixtures throughout the cup. Complexity is a measure of how difficult it is to describe a system. The mixing leads to greater complexity as there is a heterogeneous distribution of the two substances. However, as entropy progresses, the milk and coffee become thoroughly mixed and homogeneous in such a way that the system returns to a low level of complexity. Each part of the beverage contains a similar content as any other. But there's also a low level of order. There's no longer any distinction between coffee and foamed milk. In this example, entropy is necessary for complexity. And this is how something as complex as life and human intelligence may emerge as a result of entropy, even if ultimately it will be responsible for dissolving that complexity as well. How does this relate to the death drive and pleasure principle? The death drive does produce a tendency toward a kind of annihilation. However, it does so by the most circuitous paths, along the paths of life. In other words, the pleasure principle of the life drive emerges from the death drive's march toward an absolute minimum of tension. As such, they're always mixed together in different degrees. Freud says as much, indicating that the death drive would elude us if not for its principal expression through eros. This reveals an interesting parallel. Eros, or the life drive, derives from the death drive, but the death drive is observed only in and through the life drive, where it comes to be expressed by the compulsion to repeat. In the next video, we'll return to Lecture 7, take up this notion of repetition and how exactly it sustains the living being, what it teaches us about how abject failure rather than adaptation is the means for a specifically human kind of learning, and what Kierkegaard offers us to our understanding of the concept of repetition. As always, thank you for watching. Until next time, be well.